I do have a webcam on the thing, but I'm not using the webcam, I'm using my phone. Put it on here then. It might take a few minutes to warm up. Hi, I'm just setting it up.
Right, do you want me to shut the door?
You can do. I mean,
I'm just a bit worried about any noise pollution
yeah,
coming
I
through because
suppose.
I have to come out in the kitchen for any reason. So I will want to stop
Yeah,
the sofa
okay.
at some point.
No, not this one. Stream. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay. No, I don't want to do this one. All right. Okay. Okay. Hi. I'm Helen Clare Gould, and I write science fiction, and I occasionally write a bit of poetry and stuff as well. So for tonight's live stream, the first I hope of a few, I'm going to read you a poem to start and a poem to end, and in the middle I'm going to read you a section from one of my stories. So the first poem is called Tangerines and Triangles, and although I wrote this poem when I was about 14, over 50 years ago now, it wasn't until I was 17 that I entered it into an all Surrey poetry competition. I lived in Surrey in those days, and it won. So here is Tangerines and Triangles. She came to me in honey and whispered through the moon, a garden full of flowers, a carpet. Tangerines and triangles, in black and gold thrown in relief. The sun's not what it seems. Shadows fall and conquer all. Time moves on and away. Planets whirl along their course, a carpet full of dreams. So slightly unfortunately, when it was published in the magazine for the poetry competition, they printed the first line of the third verse as shadows pool and conquer all, which didn't totally make sense. Typos, eh? That was my little introductory piece. And I'm now going to move. We've had a sort of science fictional poem, and I'm now going to move to some science fiction. It is kind of science fiction blended with ecological fantasy. This is a reading from The Stallion. It was on the outskirts of the souk that I first glimpsed it. Pure white, a stallion, flared nostrils exhaling steam. Elemental, a figure out of the foundry of hell itself. It trotted past the great trunks of the Caliban trees, weaving a pattern between them that paralleled their movements. Its eyes glinted red and wild in the sunlight, meeting mine with a knowing gleam and innate insolence. My pulse flared and the blood trembled in my veins, yet I couldn't look away. Despite my fear, the horse's beauty caught at my heart. The grey disappeared around the edge of the forest where the Calibans grew more thickly, and for several moments I stood staring after it. I remember that morning well. I drew the grah mule to a post sunk in the ground, hobbled it with the halter, and stood watching it. A blast of heat and light struck me as one of the nearby Calibans shifted. I fanned myself with my hands. The grah mule gave me a long stare, then turned away to munch on tough brownish stalks, the nearest equivalent of grass on Thargos 4. It bore little resemblance to terrestrial grass. Leafless, it had only stalks and roots. On the way back to my father's stall, I passed old Sadiq. His forehead and crooked nose bore several horseshoe-shaped imprints, and the keffiyeh which framed his face did nothing to cover the scars, or opaque pupils. As usual, a crowd of children were gathered around him to hear his stories. Even adults at nearby stalls paid him attention between customers. I'd listened too, many times, to stories about the landing, stories of desert creatures that nobody really believed in anymore, to 100 other tales of echoes of the past, things none of us could imagine. The most popular stories with children were those about this land. I caught a snatch of the story. I was a horse handler, the best, while I still had my eyes. That's why I came here, to care for the horses we brought with us. My footsteps slowed. It was a tale I'd never heard before. But the ship was damaged on arrival, and horses are sensitive animals. Of all the things they dislike about starships, being suddenly released from stasis after a trip is the worst. So as I led the first screaming animal from the stalls and down the ramp, the creature bucked and stood nigh upright. He was a great stallion with the purest white coat I'd ever seen, and I'd seen a lot of horse flesh. And his eyes were pale and without pigmentation, a manifestation of a mutated virus from the frontier planets. But as he glared at me, they were red with fear and anger. My last sight was of his hooves striking for my face. Then the pain came and I crouched on the ramp. My hands covered my broken face while his hoofbeats thundered into the distance and 100 horses streamed after him into the desert. I was lucky not to be trampled to death in the stampede. Sadiq sucked in a quivering breath. For a moment I feared he wouldn't be able to continue speaking, but after a convulsive swallow he continued. Nearly all the horses escaped with that graze, so there are few in Adiba now, and most of the traders. Here Sadiq waved a hand at the stalls around him, despite his inability to see them. Well, don't your fathers use the lizards as pack mules? Yes, and much trouble they are too, someone muttered nearby. Children giggled. Sadiq waited till the chuckles subsided before speaking again. And so we've learnt to associate the return of the horses with the return of the ships. I remembered then that I was on an errand for my father. As Sadiq began a new tale, I wandered back to the stall. The sun rode higher in the sky, and its heat drummed at my temples, but as I threaded between booths near the outskirts of the bazaar, where Calibans and bare red earth gave way to native grasses, I saw the stallion. And Sadiq's story came back to me. I let out a shuddering sigh, blinked moisture from my eyes, and hastened my steps. Father had already laid everything out. On the stall, shaded by hides nailed to a wooden frame, lay great piles of tooled and plain leatherwork, the little bags for carrying the Quran, belts, purses, sandals, shoes and boots, these last nearly tall enough to keep the fine quartz grains from sifting between the toes to chafe them. There were supple leathern cloaks and curved swords, relics of the old days on earth that some of the men still wore. "Where were you, boy?" Father growled. "Tethering the mule." I injected innocence into my words. I wasn't ready to share my vision of the horse with him, nor would I have revealed my earlier fancy that the Calibans were trying to tell me something. He'd laugh or say I was daydreaming. "I've been asked by the teacher to find out if your son's here again, Muzammil." We both turned. The superintendent always rode a bay horse with a regretful air. I was near enough to smell leather polish and sweat. The mare gazed at me, flicking her black tail to dislodge grazing insects, and I realised for the first time that her expression echoed her rider's. "I do hope you're not encouraging Bashir to miss his schooling so he can help you on the stall again." No, not at all," Father lied. The mare turned her reproachful gaze on him. "I am glad to hear it," said the superintendent, and walked his mount away from the stall. He was a man of power, the source of order within our community, the possession of a horse his badge of office. I gazed after him for a moment, envying him the bay. And yet not, for she could in no way stand up to comparison with the magnificence of the white stallion, though I almost dreamed that creature after all. "You'd best get to school then, son," said my father. "Don't forget this." He took a pocket-sized copy of the Quran from its leather bag around his neck, kissed it and handed it to me. To protect it, he'd bound it in fine leather he'd cured himself. I took it and kissed it. Then he handed me the bag from round his neck. I shortened the strap and slipped it over my neck, then slid the holy book back in the bag so that it lay against my heart. Beside me, father spotted a potential customer and yelled, "Fine leathers!" I turned to go. Hooves pounded the earth as the white stallion thundered round the end of the stall. It stood before me for a moment and pondered the wares laid there. Then its eyes roved across the stall to father, then to me. An unnatural hush fell on the marketplace. In the distance, a child cried. I dared not move. The great horse's flanks expanded. Its wild spirit and nobility filled those eyes. Red and slitted, they reflected the sun in the clearing. The marketplace rabble receded. For a moment there was only myself and the stallion in the souk, boy and horse juxtaposed, the wild and free against the chained. Then it drew itself in, and determination filled its eyes. It moved closer. It was huge. I stepped back involuntarily as I remembered how Sadiq had lost his sight. I held up my hands in a warding gesture. A pang tightened my stomach. It shook its head. Its silky mane flew in several directions at once, though the air was still. Its breath was hot on my skin. I turned and ran. The holy book bumped against my breast. I laid a hand against it to protect it. In between stalls and people I dodged, round a fruit booth. Rich scents of peaches and dates mingled in my nostrils. My arm caught a basket. Melons thudded on the ground. Hoofbeats clattered behind me. I dared not check how close the horse was. I spun to my right and pushed between traders. One of them shouted. No doubt he thought it a child's game. Ahead, people jumped back. I wasn't sure if they sought to avoid me or the stallion. The hoofbeats were louder now. Terror invaded me. To my right was a stall crammed with brasswares. I sensed sanctuary within the frame, twisted and dropped to the ground, wriggled between the planking and curled up and hoped the stallion wouldn't see me in the gloom. Through a gap in the drapes, I saw the stall holder's ankles. He stood before his stall. "Only 18 credits for this vase." "Too much at that." The stallion skidded to a halt that scuffed up a cloud of sand by the stall. His head swung from side to side. He still sought me. I felt his presence. Can he sense mine? The idea panicked me. There was a crash from behind as the stallion reared up and kicked at the booth. I crept towards the light at the other end of the frame. If I can escape without him noticing. But as I squirmed back into daylight, Oh, who's that? No, I want it to be... Oh, that's annoying. Excuse me a minute. Just need to change this a bit. Okay, right, I'll have to do it that way then. All right, that's not how I like to do it, but, you know. Okay, sorry about that. I noticed some, yeah. Right, so, I crept towards the light at the other end of the frame. If I can escape without him noticing... But as I squirmed back into daylight, the stallion awaited me. I backed away and dashed towards father's stall. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the superintendent ride up to a trader and shout something. The man nodded and turned away. I hardly had time to think. At my back, I felt a stall's planks and smelt the reek of leather. I'd gone round in a circle. Someone screamed. Father was on his knees. He wrung his hands before the great horse. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. I turned to face the stallion. His breath on my skin was hotter than the sun. The sounds of the marketplace receded, replaced by a sense of isolation from the rest of humanity. The stallion stood regarding me with that same quizzical look of reproach that the bay had worn. The superintendent dared not approach. I knew I had to get away from this insane creature. Surely he intended to kill me, or at least maim me as he had Sadiq. I thought to climb one of the trees, but what if it moves as I climb? But the top of our stall was sturdy enough. Dead Caliban wood was forever stilled. I scrambled upwards. From my vantage point, I looked around. I remember the brass nails in the top of the stall holding planks and skins together. The smell of leather and sweat hung raw and crude in the air like distant battle smoke. I couldn't see father. He must have fled. The stallion nudged the planking. I felt it shake and settle again. I clung to the frame. The stallion reared and struck the stall with hooves that glistened in the sunlight. Leather tore. The lower planks split like matchwood. My heart jerked. I clung to the centre frame. I pulled myself astride it. I crouched, unable to move anywhere. I was trapped. In the background, a voice repeated the same phrases over and over, but I couldn't make sense of the words. The carpet booth stood hard by our stall. It was just near enough to pull myself over. I wriggled along the centre frame. At the end, I cast a look at the great white horse. He stared back at me. I gathered myself up. I grabbed for the next stall top as I tried to escape the fate this creature had decided for me. All the while, I held his gaze. My hands struck the centre frame. They bounced off numb. I discovered then that Caliban wood was hard as iron, even cushioned with leather. I lost my grip and slid down the shade. My world narrowed down to a sheet of red leather, to clawing for scale-barked wood with hands that didn't quite work, to listening between gasps for the hiss of breath and the sound of hooves. But I heard other sounds. The creak of leather and swish of fabric as men moved, a clash of metal followed by a curse, arrows knocked to bows, swords slid from scabbards. Understanding came. They're going to kill the stallion. Fear and sorrow overwhelmed me. His beauty had captured my soul, despite Sadiq's loss. Ready? That one word was clear, even against the background jabber of the souk. Swoosh! An arrow slit the air. It buried itself in the wood, not an arm's length below me. The shock ran through the stall frame. I turned to face the superintendent's men. Leather split under my weight. Appalled, I slid earthwards. The wooden edge of the stool caught under my arms, and the jolt numbed my shoulders and winded me. My legs dangled in the air. I realised the voice I heard was father's as he prayed. The white stallion shrieked a protest and thundered towards the archers. I heard them scatter. There were more hoofbeats. Teeth closed on my leg. I knew fear and expected pain. Strangely, none came, though the stallion had gripped my leg in his mouth. I dared turn to look at him as he tugged at the limb. His eyes were white too, but hot as ever, fueled by desperation. That made us equals, each in our own way. The stallion released my leg. I felt his nose against me, exploring. He passed alongside, nudging me, and held my gaze with a look as purposeful as any man's. Of a sudden, I realised I'd misunderstood his intention all along. Weak with relief, I allowed myself to drop onto his back. I bent my head to his ear and whispered, "What is it that you want?" I caught a glimpse of father crouched near the ruin of our stall. My cloak was folded up in his arms. Nearby, the superintendent's men regrouped. There were shouts from them. "This way, Bashir. Ride him over here." Now they planned to trap the stallion, I realised. I held up my hands, to which awareness was flowing back in painful pulses, to stop the archers from shooting. "It's all right," I called. "Put down your bows and arrows. He means me no harm." My father's voice was louder than the rest. "Bashir, come here, son." He ran towards me, but two of the superintendent's men grabbed him. He struggled in their grip. "Curse you, man. I want my boy safe. Let me get to him." He freed himself from one man with a punch, but the other held on tight. "Don't be a fool, Muzamil. That's a rogue horse there." The stallion drew in a lungful of hot air and whinnied a protest. He gave me no time to regain strength in my hands. We were away. I clung to his mane and lay low against his neck. Not even the superintendent dared follow us. We headed out into the desert, away from the caravans. The sun bombarded us with heat and dust. The great horse thundered along beneath me. After a while, his hooves no longer sounded like steps, just urgent drumbeats. I narrowed my eyes against the wind. The dunes blurred red around me. My hands had passed through the stages of numbness and pain and arrived at a place where only occasional hot needles stabbed them. Thank you very much. Sorry about the initial confusion. Okay, so I'm not intending to do more than half an hour, so I've now got a little poem for you, and it's called Rainbow Baby. I wrote it for my son. You were the rainbow baby. Within a week of birth, your hair had changed from black to red to blonde, and now it's brown, but your beard is red. From straight to wavy, and now it's straight again. And thick, following the shape of your skull like raven's wings, feather on feather on feather. Eyes of china blue became eyes of green, then hazel, now brownish, the shade of your hair. Your eyelashes were auburn for the first 2 years of your life. They said I was lucky to have such a beautiful child, that your hands were piano hands. Now they're strong, square hands with elegant, supple fingers. You were always big for your age, but you tower above me while I shrink from year to year. When a baby is born, its mother has no idea of what it will become, how it will grow, change, mature, and discover itself in the process. In 21 years, you have become a man with a heart of truth and freedom, a mind of understanding and perpetual learning, and an essence which incorporates music and wordplay and all that you are, or will become when you step out on the stage of life. I am so proud to be called Mother. Thank you so much. Thank you for the messages, guys. I hadn't realised that that was not way up. Okay, I'm going to love you and leave you now. Hopefully I'll get it right next time. So all that remains is for me to wish you all a lovely evening. Thank you so much. Bye.